gentlemen, here we are. We've done the top 5 favorites. Now we're doing the top 5 worst of all time. And in the interest of fairness, we're going to start with Mopars. So most of these are going to obviously be my opinions, but a lot of them are going to speak for themselves, and I don't think there's going to be too much debate on these. Without further ado, let's get at it. Coming in at number 5, we have the Dodge Neon. The Dodge Neon was in production from 1995 to 2005 when it was discontinued. They did bring back the nameplate in 2016 when the Dodge Dart was discontinued for foreign sales. They never did end up bringing it to the American market, even though there was plans for that. So the American run was from 95 to 05. The Dodge Neon was a entry-level economy car. It was meant to be an affordable car, point A to point B for the everyman, and it was just that. It was affordable. It was cheap. The build quality was absolute garbage, like most Chrysler products in the early 90s, mid 90s, all the way even up into the early to mid 2000s. The Dodge Neon was the perfect example of you are buying a car just because you're broke and you can't afford nothing else, and you need something that's going to be pretty decent on gas mileage, because it gets upwards of 29 miles per gallon on the highway. So at the time, that was pretty solid. So getting into the motor and the specs, I mean, they had a 2.0 liter inline 4-cylinder. It had a single overhead cam version with 132 horsepower and 129 pound-feet of torque. They had a double overhead cam version in the RT models that had 150 horsepower and 133 pound-feet of torque. Now, those numbers may sound garbage, and let's be honest, especially by today's standards, they are. But by the standards of the time, that was actually pretty decent horsepower for the cars of the day. I mean, you're talking about, this thing had better horsepower and better torque than the Honda Civic, the Nissan Sentra, the Ford Escort, the Toyota Corolla, Saturn S Series, and Chevy Cavalier, all of which were direct competitors to this car. So this thing was outperforming everybody as far as horsepower. The gas mileage numbers were all comparable. So this was definitely a competitor for that entry-level, cheap economy car that people were looking for at the time, especially after the gas prices had really crushed everybody in the 70s and 80s. People were looking for a lot more fuel economy at the time. Now let's get back to the power. I mentioned the 1998 Dodge Neon RT, which is when the RT was introduced. That had the double overhead cam and had a 5-speed manual transmission. This thing clocked in a 0 to 60 time of 7.6 seconds and a quarter-mile time of 15.9 seconds. That is absolute ass. That is just garbage. That's trash. Pickup trucks in the 90s and pickup trucks today are doing better times than that. You're talking about, most full-size pickup trucks with V8s on 2-wheel drive mode are getting 0 to 60 times in the low 7s. So that's abysmal. Again, for the time, that would scoot a little bit for the time, but in general, when you compare it to the muscle car era of the 60s and 70s, and then you compare it to modern power now, 7.6 seconds in a car is absolute nonsense. Like, that should never happen, ever. So on top of having cheap build quality, having a BS garbage economy car that's just point A to point B, it doesn't even have zip to it. It doesn't even have any power. It doesn't get out of its own way. It was literally a miserable experience. If you're a car person and you enjoy driving, you enjoy the handling of the car and the speed and everything, this is not the car for you. And really, honestly, unless all you're concerned about is gas mileage, this isn't the car for anybody. I mean, these things were cheap pieces of junk. Now, for the second gen of Neon, from 2000 to 2005, the horsepower and all that didn't really change much for the standard Neon. And, the car got a little bit better as far as creature comforts and features and everything. You started having, power windows, and you started having, factory air conditioning from, the start. So little things that we take for granted now, we're finally starting to be more prevalent in the Neons. But having said that, we need to fast forward to 2003, when the Dodge and Chrysler Corporation introduced the 2003 Srt4 Neon. Why is the Srt4 Neon such a big deal? I'll tell you why. it's the one saving grace that this car has, and it's the one thing that puts it at number 5 instead of number 2, 3, or 1. That SRT4 had a 2.4 liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. And that thing would crank out 215 horsepower and 230 pound-feet of torque. And eventually, for the 04 and 05 years, it was 230 and 250, respectively. These things were surprising. They kind of got a little bit of a cult following. They kind of took the car world by storm because, Dodge created the Neon. Chrysler in general created the Neon to get into the economy market a little deeper, try to take sales away from Toyota and Chevy and all that for the economy cars. But this was right around the time, Fast and Furious was getting popular, and, all of the tuner craze was going on, and Dodge, with the history of performance and muscle cars and everything, they figured, why not get into like the tuner performance aspect or the sector of the car community. And they did. This SRT4 was killing people. Like, it was smoking people. And people were like, oh, it's a Dodge Neon. No, this is not a Dodge Neon. They actually dropped the Neon nameplate for the SRT4. So it was just called the Dodge SRT4. And to be clear, back in the 2000s and up until maybe like 2010-ish, Dodge was labeling their SRT performance cars as SRT and then a number at the end, and the number typically translated to the cylinders in the car. So you had the Challenger SRT8 because it was a V8. You had the Crossfire SRT6, which was a V6, and you had the Neon SRT4, or they cut the Neon off, but it was SRT4 because it was an SRT 4-cylinder. So this thing was scooting from 0 to 60. You're talking, for the 03 model, it was 5.7 seconds, and with the horsepower boost for the later models, it was 5.6 seconds, which is still pretty solid even for today's time. Back then, I mean, it was scooting, and it was just cleaning up the competition. Now, the SRT4 Neon did not blow away anybody in sales or anything like that. And honestly, like a lot of things, Dodge was not big in the the tuner world at the time, so nobody took it seriously. But since then, this car has developed a huge cult following. The build quality didn't get a whole lot better, maybe minorly. It didn't get a whole lot better, though. It was still cheap plastic, it was still cheap garbage, but at least at the same time, with being cheap plastic and cheap garbage, this thing had a turbocharged 4-cylinder that was smoking a lot of cars. I personally have lined up against one of these and been thoroughly surprised in the past at how quick these things were. I mean, these things would take off on you, and that turbo spooled up and that thing was gone. This thing was only about 2,900 pounds, so that's way lighter than Mustangs and Camaros. I mean, the American sports cars are still bloated pigs compared to this car. So this thing had a lot working for it. If it wasn't for the fact that the Neon nameplate had been so slammed and slandered with how garbage they were, the SRT4 might have taken off a little bit better. But they eventually discontinued the car in 2005, which was also the last model year of the SRT4. And if it wasn't for the SRT4, man, this thing would probably be much higher on the list. Coming in at number 4, we have the Dodge Caliber. What is the Dodge Caliber, you ask? You're going to regret asking, but I'm glad you asked. The Dodge Caliber, after the Neon had been discontinued in 2005, the Dodge Caliber was Dodge's next effort at the tuner scene, the performance scene, and also the continuation of the economy car. They tried to repair some of the damage that was done to the Neon nameplate because, I mean, it was a garbage car. So this was their follow-up effort. And initially, when the Caliber was released, it was released in 2007 model year. It came with a 1.8 liter, 148 horsepower, 125 pound-feet of torque motor, or a 2.0 liter, both 4 cylinders, 158 horsepower, 141 pound-feet of torque. This was the SE and later called the SXT model. These things were exactly what you would expect. The quality went up a little bit from the Neon to the caliber. I mean, by the mid to late 2000s, Dodge had slowly started to improve their interior and their build quality. Not a lot. I mean, these things were still not great. It wasn't until like 2010 and later that Dodge really started picking up on the interior quality and stuff like that. So these calibers were a step better as far as interior quality, and that's probably what saves it and makes it a little higher than the Neon. Is the overall of the car is better, even though I think it was a huge swing and a miss. The design, the looks, the styling, I think they were shooting for that specific tuner section, and they completely whiffed. I think they were looking for that sporty fastback hatchback feel, and it looks like they took a Dodge Journey and just shrunk it down into like a baby Journey. I think it's one of the ugliest cars that Dodge has ever made, and pumping out the RT model did not make it any better. For the 2008 model year, they introduced the RT model, which was a 2.4 liter, 168 horsepower, 165 pound-feet of torque, inline four-cylinder. The numbers got a little bit better. It was a little bit more respectable, but you're still not competing with some of the numbers that were put out by the Srt4 Neon, and there's really no salvaging this thing at this point. There was a minor trim differences, minor badging differences, but it still looked like the economy garbage caliber that was released on the public to very little fanfare. I mean, at the time, people were talking about it a little bit, but I mean, this thing fell flat pretty quickly. I mean, it only ran from 07 to 2012. I mean, it died off pretty quickly. And then eventually, they released the SRT4 model, which was supposed to try and grab a hold of all the people that started following on the Neon SRT4 and try to pull that sector and try to maybe get them into a newer model with more performance. But what actually happened was Dodge pumped out a nonsensical garbage 2.4 liter double over cam 16 valve turbo four-cylinder with 285 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque. Now, on paper, those numbers should have mopped up the SRT4 Neon. Unfortunately, while that Neon was 2,900 pounds, because of the quality build interior, all the extra gadgets and stuff they started slapping in this car, the weight went from 2,900 pounds to almost 3,200 pounds. This thing gained almost 300 pounds of weight, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it shows in the performance numbers. While that Neon SRT4 was getting about 5.6, 5.7 0 to 60 time, this SRT4 caliber was getting 6.7 seconds. 6.7 seconds. Modern V6, naturally aspirated V6s in 4,200 pound Chryslers are getting better 0 to 60 times than that. And this was a performance car for them. And it's got a quarter mile time of 15 seconds compared to the Neon SRT4's low 14s. I mean, this thing was just a swing and a miss to and from start to back. I mean, this thing, the performance side of it was just absolutely not able to salvage this thing again. The only reason this is the only reason this isn't higher is because the build quality did get a little bit better, not a lot. And the reason this is number 4 instead of number 5, like the Neon at least had that saving grace of the performance. This thing, not so much. But the build quality did save it a little bit, so that's preventing it from going all the way up to this might even be closer to number 1 if it wasn't for the slight increase in build quality. And here we are at number 3. And this is the one that I think might have the mobs coming out from my head. The Mopar guys, this car has kind of a cult following. And my opinion on the cars that this is in direct competition with are probably what's going to get me assaulted in the streets. But number 3, we have the Dodge Rampage. What is the Dodge Rampage, you ask? And the fact that you have to keep asking me what these cars are just goes to show why they're on this list. But the Dodge Rampage was the direct competition to the El Camino and the Ford Ranchero. Okay, and if you don't know what the Ford Ranchero is, slightly understandable. If you don't know what the El Camino is, you're on the wrong channel. You're on the wrong side of YouTube, and you need to either stick around and learn something, or you need to just walk on and give up. So the El Camino, for those who don't know and that are sticking around to learn, the El Camino it's technically labeled a truck. It's got a truck bed, but at the front half of the vehicle is a car. So I've always considered them cars that are basically topless station wagons, but they're technically labeled trucks. They have tow capacities and haul capacities and stuff like that. But Chevy eventually started pumping out performance models, and Ford and Dodge, once they saw that the El Camino, for some god-awful reason, I personally hate the El Caminos. If you love them, fantastic. I appreciate and understand and respect your opinion, but I think they are the most absolute garbage, disgusting Chevys that have ever been made, among the top 5. So trust me, it's probably going to be on that list. Don't worry. But the El Camino, to me, you're either a car or a truck. Pick one. This mishmash, Frankensteining together two vehicles never worked for me, never sold me on it. I hate them. I can't stand them. I think they're stupid. I think Chevy was stupid for creating it. I think Ford was even dumber for copying it. And I think Dodge was even dumber for thinking that they needed to get involved in this whole thing. But the Rampage was was in production from 1982 to 1984. It had a 2.2 liter carbureted i4 inline 4-cylinder. So this again was in that K car era in the 80s, where cars were severely underpowered because the oil embargo had hit us in the 70s and horsepower started diminishing. And as time went on and into the 80s, everybody, Ford, Dodge, Chevy, all the foreign cars, they were all suffering. All of them, if you look at an 80s car, they're pretty much all going to be underpowered and they're going to be uninspired. This thing had a 2.2 liter carbureted inline 4-cylinder. It had an anemic 84 horsepower, eventually climbing up to 96 horsepower and 119 pound-feet of torque, or 99 horsepower and 122 pound-feet of torque. Now, how garbage is this car? How uninspired is this car? How not worth talking about this car is this car? It's so bad that it took me 35 minutes to even find those numbers that I gave you. Finding horsepower numbers was pretty easy. Finding the torque numbers was a little bit more difficult. And there are zero websites or sources that will give you the 0 to 60 or quarter mile time for this car, because it's not worth talking about. Unless you're doing a how garbage is that car list, like we are. So then it's worth talking about. So I dug a little bit, and in researching the 2.2 liter carbureted motor, I did find some 0 to 60 times of similar cars that were using that same motor. And those cars, I believe, were actually slightly heavier because of the open body design of the Rampage. It much lighter. It was only about 2,400 pound curb weight. I believe these other cars were in that 2,600 pound range. But the 0 to 60 time on these cars was 8.7 seconds with a quarter mile time of 16.7 seconds. You know, you would think that something called the Rampage, and something that had what was an attempt at aggressive performance-inspired styling, would be a little bit better than 8.7 seconds. I mean, it was common for the time. This was the 80s, you know, the 82 to 84 era. So all the cars were hit with low horsepower, low performance. You know, Camaros and Mustangs of the day were just as anemic, you know, maybe not 84 horsepower, but they were just as anemic. The times were garbage. So this is a common problem. But the fact that Dodge, and what places this car on this list and places it so high on this list for me, is that Dodge saw an opportunity. They went, oh my God, the El Camino is super popular. No idea why, but the El Camino is super popular, and it's high time we get in on this El Camino craze. And they jumped in and they took a swing with all they had, and they just failed. You know, there's a small cult following for this car. I did find a bunch of pictures where people were plastering 2.2 liter Rampage all over their car like it was something super exciting and to talk about. But this is, to me, is a flat out gigantic miss. The looks are terrible. I think the design is terrible. I already hate the half car, half truck design, but I think they completely bombed, because the Lee Iacocca K Cars by themselves were just terribly designed as far as looks and appearance. They're just uninspired, they're boring, and on top of it, they try to take something boring and they try to make it aggressive looking in the most boring way possible. I mean, the Rampage, top to bottom, is just absolute garbage, and I'm embarrassed to even say that it's a Mopar, but unfortunately it is. So, do yourself a favor, YouTube and Google up the Rampage if you're bored and you want to laugh at people getting excited about a dog-ass car. So, there's your number 3. Coming in at number 2, it had to be this one. It had to be. And as soon as I give you the reveal, you're gonna see it was no other option. And you know what? There's a small sector of people that love this car. They die by this car. They live and breathe this car. You'll never get me to understand why. But wait for it. Coming in at number 2, we have the PT Cruiser. I don't even know where to start with this thing. I mean, first off, I get what Chrysler was going for. This is somewhat of a beach cruiser. I don't recall if the HHR, the Chevy HHR came out first or this came out first. I believe the PT Cruiser came out first, and it was trying to get that summer beach vibe going. And I think the HHR tried to jump on, because the PT Cruiser actually did fairly well initially in sales, and the HHR tried to jump on the wagon and suck up some of those PT Cruiser sales. But this thing was just absolute trash, just absolute trash. It looks like they took a 30s or a 40s mobster car and just shrunk it down into this tiny little beach cruiser. This car doesn't look like it could really pick what it was trying to be as far as appearance goes. Uninspired. I think the lines on this car are too soft. It's the overall shape and body design. It could have been done much better. There have been beach cruisers in the past, in the 60s and 70s, and I know I'm biased to the era, but the 60s and 70s they've had beach cruisers that were very well done. This one, not so much. Everything is cheap plastic on this car, which is commonplace for the 90s and 2000s Chrysler products and a lot of cars at the time. Cheap plastic, everything goes wrong with these cars. This thing is just absolute garbage from top to bottom. They had cheap interiors. They had numerous unending reports of transmission problems, computer problems, head gasket problems, AC problems. I mean, this car. I mean, a lot of people like to rag on Dodge and Chrysler and stuff like that, but in reality, if you take care of your car should last you upwards of 100, 200,000 miles easy. These things at 80, 90,000 were starting to just fall apart, and by the 125,000 mile mark, these things were getting to the point where you were sinking so much money into these cars, you might as well go get an exotic car, or an exotic European car, because you're spending the same damn money. Because everything's always breaking, everything's falling apart. These PT Cruisers, which blows my mind, because when you look at the if you Google this car and you look at the customer satisfaction reviews, they're actually surprisingly high for a car so bad. I mean, you're talking like low to mid 4s on a scale of 5. These people, like, customer satisfaction reviews, it blows my mind, because I've known multiple people that have had these cars, and I've dealt with people that have had these cars, and I've researched and Google reviewed and YouTube viewed. These things are hot garbage from personal experience and from research experience. These things are garbage. So I don't know how they have such high customer satisfaction, because these things have constant reports of problems. And you talk to any person that has ever worked in a shop, these things are always in there getting these things that I mentioned replaced. But these things are absolute ass, just garbage from start to finish, top to bottom. And there's no redeeming qualities about this car. This thing has a 2.4 liter inline 4. It's got 150 horsepower, 162 pound-feet of torque. It has 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds. 8.5. This is a car in 2001 to 2010 that has a 0 to 60 time 0.2 seconds faster than the Rampage that had 80 something horsepower. So there's no redeeming qualities about this thing. Now let me go one step further. That 8.5 seconds 0 to 60 is on the manual option. If you were to get an automatic PT Cruiser, this thing went 0 to 60 in 10.9 seconds. That is 0 to 60 in eventually That is a 0 to 60 in one of these days. That is 0 to 60 in, oh my God, I got time to go home and make a 6-course meal and eat before the car gets to 60. This is in 10.9 seconds. Like, I've seen, like, bicycles can probably go 0 to 60 faster than that. This is in 10.9 seconds. The quarter mile, 17.6 seconds in this car. Like, you could literally, some of these cars on the top 5 list could finish multiple quarter miles in the time this thing finishes 1 quarter mile. I mean, it's absolute garbage. So there's no redeeming qualities about this thing. The looks are terrible. The build quality is terrible. The reliability is terrible on these things. The 0 to 60 and the quarter mile performance times are absolutely abysmal. The styling is uninspired. The styling is boring. There's nothing aggressive about this car. Everything is just blah. This car is just so bland and so boring. And if you like this car and you follow this channel, I apologize. Don't unfollow. I know I don't have enough people to risk losing followers yet, but if you like this car, stop. Send me a private message and we'll go over some things. We'll discuss better options for you. There has to be. If you give me the reasons why you like this car, I guarantee you I can find you a better car that would suit your needs better than this. This is the most absolute abysmal garbage car that Chrysler has probably ever produced, aside from our next one. And here we are at number 1. You might be asking yourself, when he was finishing up the last car, did he say the next cars? And the answer would be yes, it did. Good eye, good ear, good job. So number 1 is not a specific car. Number 1 is a specific group of cars. And they've been mentioned a couple times if you're paying attention in this top 5 so far. What is number 1? The Chrysler K Cars. Anybody that knows cars has to know this had to have been coming at some point. If it wasn't 2 through 5, it had to be number 1, right? What are the K Cars? Glad you asked, because most people probably have no clue. So these are a platform of car. All right. So if you look at the vehicles from the manufacturer standpoint, these are the labels that they put. They've had L platforms, they've had A platforms, and so on and so forth. This is the K platform. This thing was introduced in 1981, and it ran. The technical window of time that the K Cars ran was from 1981 to 1989, but a lot of the cars that were made in the 80s, their model years, their models actually carried into later years, all the way up to some of the minivans ran until 1995 before being discontinued. But the technical window of time for the K Cars was 1981 to 1989. Now, these were always credited as the brainchild, the baby of Lee Iacocca, who came over to Chrysler with the intent of saving Chrysler. Because don't get it twisted, after the oil embargo hit and the horsepower wars came to a screeching halt, Dodge was struggling. Dodge and Chrysler were struggling hard. They were falling flat on their face, and they were literal inches away from folding up and shutting down as a company. So Chrysler brought in Lee Iacocca to try and salvage and revitalize the company. Now, though this is labeled as Lee Iacocca's baby, the K Cars were actually already starting in production in the late 1978 timeframe. But Lee Iacocca was the one that came in and put the final touches on it and kind of sorted through everything and got everything rolling. Okay, so the concept behind the K Cars and the K platform is that Dodge had taken so many different models that were made so incredibly differently that the mindset was that it was costing them too much money. You know, if you were building this car here, car A over here, and you were building car B over here, there weren't enough parts that were similar to be able to just mass produce parts. You had to produce enough parts for this car, produce enough parts for this car, and they had over close to 50 different models and brands, you know, things that were sold only in the other countries, only in America, you know, things that were sold in Mexico, so on and so forth. So the idea behind the K Car platform was that they were going to start basically building cars that were essentially cookie cutter options of each other. So that way they could just mass produce parts and just, if you were making part A and part B, car A and car B, you didn't have to salvage parts for this and then make parts for that. Everything was like, okay, we've got this particular part, it goes in both cars, boom, mass produce them and send them out. And it was supposed to save them money, and it did. It saved Chrysler a ton of money, to the point where Chrysler was able to limp along until they could start salvaging their business and get back in the big three again. And now Chrysler is still doing the same idea as the K concept today. You look at the current Chargers and Challengers and 300 and stuff, they're all off the LHS platform. So they're all basically the same car, with the exception of the exterior design, maybe certain gear ratios and stuff like that. But essentially, you could literally take a Charger body off and put a 300 body on, and with the exception of certain designs like emblems and stuff on the interior, it'd be the same basic car. So that was the idea for the K cars. Did it work? Yes, it worked. And you would think that the K cars saving Chrysler from going under would have been enough to keep them out of the number one spot. But you'd be wrong. You would be 1000% wrong, because these cars were meant to be quick, cheap economy cars that were able to basically beat out the competition, because you couldn't beat their prices. And they were point A to point B cars. They were uninspired. They were boring. Even the sports cars like the Rampage, which is technically a K car, those were boring. Those were miserable and awful cars. And it eventually got to the point where, while it did save Chrysler, because Chrysler was able to put asses in cars that were, and they were causing their sales to go up. And they didn't even necessarily cause their sales to go up as much as, while they did go up, it wasn't that as much as the cost of production was cut so far down that their profit margin was going up. And it was able to save them. But the downside is, on top of saving Chrysler, it also damaged Chrysler's reputation, because while the first couple years, the K cars actually did really well, and actually sometimes people still talk about how great they are, but in reality, eventually it built, because they stopped building anything else. Everything was that K platform. So it eventually got to the point where Chrysler's reputation for build quality and everything, the build quality I kept talking about, how in the 90s it was garbage, and in the 2000s it was garbage, and they haven't improved until maybe 2010. That all spawned from the K cars, because the K cars were cookie cutter. They were just cheap, inexpensive parts. Most of them were made in concert with Mitsubishi, who Chrysler has owned for quite some time. So a lot of the parts made for these Chrysler cars were actually Mitsubishi parts, because of the ownership that Chrysler had over Mitsubishi. So in case you're interested in going back and researching how absolutely garbage these cars are, some of the more commonly known Chrysler K cars are the Dodge Aries, the Plymouth Reliant, the Chrysler LeBaron, and the Dodge 400. Take a look at them, laugh, see how absolutely garbage that they are. But they covered everything from compact to mid, full-size cars, sports cars, and minivans. These cars were absolutely garbage. Everything was cheap, everything was economy, everything was plastic, constant problems, constant maintenance, cheap, point A to point B car, no redeeming qualities. As you can see by some of the pictures I posted over here, they're uninspired styling. Absolutely everything about them screams 80s. They're ugly. They've got terrible body lines. The interiors are absolutely garbage. And there's just nothing good about these cars. There's nothing. The only redeeming quality that these cars have is that they saved Chrysler from going under. And that's it. That's it. In the long run, they ended up doing more harm than good for Chrysler, because while they did serve their purpose and they did save Chrysler from bottoming out, they eventually built up the aura or the impression around Chrysler, rightfully so, that their cars were cheap garbage that were falling apart and just absolute terrible build quality. And they suffered for decades for that. And that's why the Chrysler K cars, regardless of whoever tries to convince you that they're good or that they should be remembered more favorably than they are, that is why the Chrysler K cars are absolute garbage, and they make the number one spot with no debate and no discussion. and that's our list. Top 5 worst Mopars of all time. I don't think too many people should be arguing these points, these cars, but there's always going to be them fanboys out there that are going to love or hate my opinion on certain things, and that's fine. But next up, we're going to start tackling the other top 5 worst as well. We're going to probably try to stick in the same order: Chevys and Fords, just like the top 5 favorites. We're going to have more top 5 favorites coming as well, and we're going to have some more Magnum videos coming. So everybody check back in, stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next one.